to support the implementation of our recommendations for planning reform to support a livable catchment and suitable Parramatta River. My name is Nerida Taylor and I work for the Parramatta River Delivery Engine in Sydney Water. It is estimated in the Parramatta catchment with archaeological evidence dating back 30,000 years. We recognise the importance of Aboriginal leadership in them and emerging. Now, just a little bit of meeting etiquette. This is a short 20-minute presentation with 10 minutes allocated for question time at the end. Please use the Q&A function throughout the presentation and I will attempt to moderate the questions so we can have a robust discussion at the end. We will endeavour to answer all questions, but it may need to be at a later time. We'll also record the webinar and make it available. I'm incredibly proud of this work to develop the paper on the strategic and statutory planning reforms to realise our vision for the Parramatta River. As you can see, it's a very collaborative effort with a special thanks to our project co-leads at DPI and especially our consulting partners from Seville Consulting and Macquarie University. So I would like to formally welcome Alexa McCauley, Director at Seville Consulting, and Peter Davies, Senior Lecturer in Environmental Planning at Macquarie University, who will take you through the presentation.
Thanks, Nerida. So today's presentation focuses on land planning and development controls for the diffuse stormwater pollution and waterway health. We'll explain the issues we've identified with current approaches and why we're recommending changes that go well beyond standardising, even though that was the title of the project. We'll outline the broad directions that we're recommending for future policy, and we'll also touch on a few ideas that local government could implement in the short term. I'll start with a little bit of background to our project. There are policies in place which establish the vision, goals and objectives for the Parramatta River. So up the top there is the Parramatta River Master Plan, which establishes a vision of a world-class living river that's swimmable. The master plan identified 10 key steps towards this vision, and step number 4 was standardising the standards. Down the bottom there are Sydney's district plans, which include clear objectives, priorities and actions calling for healthy waterways. And there's also the Premier's priority for better access to quality public open space. So while we've got all those good objectives, there's also significant development planned in the Parramatta River catchment in the coming decades. There's the GPOP corridor between Greater Parramatta and Sydney Olympic Park there, where we'll see major urban renewal, but also in the surrounding area, there'll be a lot of infill development. So there's a mix of development types happening in the Parramatta River catchment, ranging from larger scale brownfields redevelopment to smaller scale infill. And we've been very aware throughout this project of those types of development that we're thinking about here. The chart at the bottom there shows projected increase in dwellings across the Parramatta catchment LGAs from 2016 to 2041, and gives you a sense of the scale of development that's underway. So what will it all mean for the Parramatta River? Sydney Water undertook a modelling study as part of the master plan in 2018, and they found that as the catchment develops, the impervious area will increase, stormwater runoff will increase, and water quality in the river will decline. So their business as usual scenario is there. And if we ask the question, where could we steer this instead? Sydney Water's study in 2018 showed that if we address wastewater overflows and implement water-sensitive urban design in development, we could see those water quality outcomes start to turn around with modest improvement by 2025. But we're concerned that even this is an optimistic picture. So when we talked to Parramatta River catchment councils about how water-sensitive urban design policies are being implemented in practice, we found some significant shortcomings. So in policy, we often define broad objectives for water-sensitive urban design, but when it comes to implementation, our focus narrows. Development is designed pretty much as usual with the addition of a stormwater quality treatment device. And the only specific targets we're setting are pollutant load reductions targets. So while they are really strong targets with a good technical basis, we aren't actually measuring the outcomes in the field. So that's a significant gap. We've tried to support implementation with various guidelines, but we're still seeing poor outcomes in development, particularly when it comes to smaller scale infill development. And of course, we talked about how none of this is easy to change. It's a really complex problem that's bound up with issues that go well beyond the planning system itself. So one other aspect of this implementation is in the riparian zone. When it comes to greenfield development, we've got relatively strong planning controls protecting riparian zones, but these aren't being implemented in infill and brownfield renewal. So we're seeing infill development that encroaches further into riparian areas. And when it comes to degraded and channelized waterways, urban renewal is missing opportunities for waterway restoration. So far we're achieving relatively little in terms of setbacks or riparian restoration in that development. So again, it's not easy to change. The past development in these kind of contexts constrains the options. And if you're dealing with one site at a time, it's difficult to envisage renewal of the close waterways. But our recommendations paper has mapped out some pathways for change. And I'll let Peter speak to you more about what the project's actually done.
Thanks, Alexa. So essentially this is, as Alexa was saying, this is a project about change. But what we also know within the catchment, the Department of Planning have got ongoing reforms, individual councils have got ongoing changes to their LEPs and DCP processes. And so we've got a whole bunch of balls that are in the air in terms of how do we move forward. And I guess when we started this journey, many months ago, we started by, I guess, listening to, some background concerns from those within state and local government as to where and why things were happening. And I guess what that evolved through the process of those initial workshops and specific and targeted workshops around development and riparian areas was slowly getting to this point of a clear understanding of where our gaps and opportunities lay. And so always the central proposition of this particular project was around standardising standards, but it's much more than that. And our consultation, I guess, started to reveal, the complexities within this process. So we know within the specific catchment, there's lots more development. Now, they're big development sites, but importantly, there's also lots of infill development. And every council seems to have slightly different ways that they manage infill, complying, local development, regional development, and so forth. And so the development types are a point of concern in terms of addressing the overall change. We also know from the rainwater harvesting approaches such as basics, now they're limited statutorily in terms of what you can increase. And so going beyond basics for a water quality standard is one of these inherent challenges that we have. We also know that developers want certainty, but we also know the development sector through basics, through water-sensitive urban design controls, is looking at minimum standards, not aspirational goal-orientated approaches. And I think there's some other approaches that sort of come to the fore here in terms of infill and brownfield sites. There's often a little incentive for water-sensitive urban design controls that couple together both the water component and the landscaping component, which is the blue and green controls. And that will be evident in terms of where we start to look at the index. One of the other things that we found was this missed opportunity within the streetscape. So for many councils, there's a decentralised lot-based control. But there's, particularly in the inner councils, up to 40% of the road area, of the total area, is within that road reserve, which includes the road reserve and footpath area, and how we can utilise that space in terms of maximising water outcomes and keeping water in the landscape. Within our riparian zones, there's geographic diversity. So we know in the northern parts of the river, there are more natural streams than there are in the southern parts of the river. We also see variations between the east and the west parts of the catchment as well. And as Alexa mentioned earlier, there's certainly a gap in our compliance, monitoring, and also our capacity to fund water-sensitive urban design by governments. So now when we start to think about opportunities for improvement, so goal-based controls are fundamentally important, and they need to link to local government as much as they need to link to environmental planning instruments and the activities of state agencies. There's a need to have an understanding about scale. So opportunities in big sites are going to be different to small sites. Small lot renovation approaches are going to and must be different to the large-scale redevelopment. This need to encourage integrated multi-purpose green infrastructure is something that tends to be missing within both the development assessment process and arguably within the policy setting, because we tend to have our water engineers focusing on water and we have our landscaping people focusing on the green bits. And so that integration is something that we're not looking at strongly enough. Riparian corridors, if you look at some other councils and particularly Kringai, they've been able to codify that within their LEP controls quite successfully. And I think that's a wonderful opportunity that emerged from this particular project. And we spoke about monitoring and need for change. So when we start to think about the directions of these policies, and we'll touch on Blue-Green Index and the green and the riparian controls in more detail in the next two webinars. But essentially what we're trying to do within this is deal with the complexity of interrelated issues. And it is within that that we start to differentiate, I guess, the index and the grid project. The index fundamentally looking at managing stormwater flow and diffuse pollution, and the blue-green grid, which is looking at riparian controls. So when we think about the index is essentially a planning control, and it's fundamentally positioned around reducing runoff. We know from monitoring, if we can get the amount of runoff lower, we're going to improve the health of the river. And so we can only do that through lots of incremental changes across the catchment, but clearly with larger development sites, you can do a little bit more. So retaining that water in the landscape is one of the fundamental things for the Blue-Green Index, but there's lots of different ways you're going to do that. You're going to do that through thinking about increasing rainwater tank size through basics. You can think about through infiltration systems, through watering, traditional urban sensitive water design. And the capacities to do that also have co-benefits in terms of increasing habitat opportunities, managing urban heat within the landscape, and also thinking about the co-benefits of public open space so that you're not just looking at a single sports field or a singular linear park or footpath. There are other opportunities that you can use. In arriving at that Blue-Green Index, there's lots of different tools that we've looked at. Melbourne is one example, Helsinki is another example. Each of them are geographically specific, so you can't just grab them and apply them. So you have to think about the nuance of where we're going within those controls. The blue-green grid is another great opportunity because you can't achieve good waterway health in the Parramatta River unless you can achieve that further up in the tributaries. And so when we start to think about the grid, we talk about the green grid, and now we're talking about the blue-green grid across the greater Parramatta River. So we need to think about those small tributaries and making the best of the opportunities in terms of ecological connectivity, in terms of stormwater improvement, because all of those have a cumulative impact in terms of the overall water health. And so there are three components within the grid. You want to improve the natural waterways. So the ones that are in reasonably good condition, they should be fundamentally important in terms of how you protect and manage. You also want to address your degraded waterway systems. So thinking about what opportunities there are in terms of reducing flow, the hydraulic load, improving water quality, improving habitat across that in-stream and riparian area. And then the third category is around our channelized or piped waterway system. Are there opportunities for daylighting? Are there opportunities for doing hydraulic or water quality or other benefits that can create additional outcomes to having a cleaner Parramatta River? Alexa.
All right, so both of those, the Blue-Green Index and the Blue-Green Grid, if you come to our secondary webinars, you'll hear more about those, each of those elements. And I just wanted to wrap up by focusing on some of the short-term updates. So our recommendations paper maps out 3 different timelines for policy change. So in the short term, many councils are looking to improve their local planning provisions within the next few years. And I'll give you a brief overview of what we've recommended there. Meanwhile, the Blue-Green Index and the Blue-Green Grid will require more work to develop, and implementation might be some time away, but the PRCG is starting on some of that work now. And then the recommendations paper, we won't spend time on it, but it does also talk about longer term supporting actions, particularly for state policies and planning instruments to back it all up. So just back to the short term, we've looked at LEPs and DCPs, and I just wanted to draw out some of the key recommendations from the paper. In terms of LEPs, I know that most of the Parramatta River catchment councils have recently updated their LEP, but next time around, 2 key recommendations there are just to review the zoning of waterways and riparian land to strengthen protection of that land, and then to look at strengthening local provisions for landscaped areas, stormwater management, water sensitive design, waterways and riparian land, and foreshore development. And in the paper, we've suggested wording for local provisions that looked at existing examples to base that on, and showed how it links with the Parramatta River Master Plan objectives and the evidence from its technical studies. I suspect that councils might have the opportunity to update their DCPs before they get around to anything else. And there is quite a mix at the moment of different DCP provisions. So there is still that standardising element that could be done in the short term. Some of our recommendations for DCPs are for basic updates, just to fill gaps in stormwater quality and waterway provisions, and bring all of those provisions in line with best practice. One important question that we grappled with here was whether the stormwater pollutant targets should be updated to align with the Parramatta River Master Plan objectives, and particularly the question of pathogen targets. And we discussed that during the project, but based on the modelling undertaken to date and the other available evidence from research to date, the best recommendation we can make today is to retain the existing targets, and pathogens are still a work in progress. Some of our other recommendations for DCPs are for changes that would help shift towards reducing runoff and retaining more water in the landscape. And while this sounds pretty simple at a conceptual level, there are some challenges. So rainwater harvesting is part of basics. The capacity for infiltration is limited in many parts of the catchment. And of course, if we want more landscape areas always compete for space with other uses. And so what we've recommended is that one simple way to reduce runoff might be to set a runoff reduction target, and then each developer has to consider the best methods to meet that target at their site. And that could be a straightforward addition to many DCPs. So our recommendations paper maps out a plan for both those short-term actions as well as longer-term plan for the PRCG to progress the Blue-Green Index and the Blue-Green Grid. And you'll hear more about each of those in the next 2 webinars, but I'll hand back to Narrative for now for the questions.
Thanks very much, Alexa and Peter. Appreciate that. Look, we will open it up to some questions now, so please get typing. I might do a little bit of a starter question, which is, I could do one on flooding because that's very topical at the moment, but I think I will do one about the recently released explanation of intended effects for the new design and place set, and just kind of how you see the alignment of that set and also, I guess, the absorption of the basic set into that, and how you think it aligns with the work we've done for the recommendations paper.
I can see at a high level that the design and place set, they're talking about some of the similar issues that we are and trying to achieve some similar things. They're talking about how we want better design outcomes. We have complex objectives. They're not single objectives that can be broken down into disciplines. They're trying to achieve these multi-objective outcomes. How do you get the planning system to do that?
Yeah.
And they're talking about principles-based planning. And they've got some slightly different ideas about how to do it. I think their focus is on a larger scale development.
Yeah.
And we've been thinking more about smaller scale as well.
Yeah, because I just think they're sort of breaking it down into lot and precinct and special development, aren't we? And we're sort of, I think, my take is we've kind of thought about those different scales a lot in the work we've done and how you kind of address it at that sort of different scale.
Yeah.
And I think there's an interesting point around the design and place set is, and its relationship to our work, is when you look at stormwater quality structures at a lot level, you'll often see in the front yards of new apartments these relatively unattractive, single-focused rain gardens, and some of them are constructed with an absolute absence of good design. And to me, there's this incredible missed opportunity where these areas within a lot are basically excluded from what is usable space for the residents and households. And so where you can start to get good places within spaces within a lot that serve multiple purposes. So it can achieve water infiltration, but it also is a nice garden, that it can also have as aesthetic. It can be a place for people to sit as opposed to this pebbled, weedy driven. We also see in rainwater tanks that it's a singular focus. It is only for rainwater tanks as opposed to on-site retention, getting water back into the landscape. So the design set has this potential to look at multiple objectives far more nuanced, in a nuanced way.
Yeah, I agree, because they're really talking about wider livability goals and getting back into that canopy cover and all the things we've talked about that we need to achieve on what to create a better city or a better catchment management. So we've got a couple more questions. This is an oldie but a goodie. Many councils span more than one catchment. What is the applicability of this work more broadly, so beyond just the Parramatta River catchment?
So immediately when the PRCG first started, and I guess I've been involved for a long time, the Cooks River and the Georges River basically said, well, what about us? So whichever creek system you're in, whether it's the ones that are draining to Sydney Harbour or thereabouts, or ones that are draining to the Hawkesbury Nepean, the value of livable rivers is ubiquitous across Sydney. People want to be able to connect to their rivers, whether it's swimming in Parramatta or swimming in South Creek, wherever. So, you know, the controls that we might be focusing on here, there's just some geographic connection to Parramatta, but it can only foster a better livable city.
And I'm sure a lot of the challenges we've talked about and ways to address those challenges, the same challenges about implementing water sensitive design and protecting waterways and restoring creeks are very similar across Sydney. And there'll be local nuance, but at a high level,
and
lots of similarities.
I think when we ran the first workshop, when we talked a lot about the from a council's point of view, and we talked a lot about that cross-boundary councils that have multiple catchments.
I think all the PRCG members, apart from City of Parramatta, do cross those catchment boundaries. Yeah.
And there was also that issue with the regional plans and that they were crossing different areas as well. But I think we kind of got to the point where we realised that a lot of the, especially the LEP and DCP stuff that is in the recommendations paper, I think that's quite prescriptive, but it's actually really strong and really applicable across all modern urbanized waterways in Sydney. I don't think that there should be a restriction, I think, including good riparian management, water sensitive urban design.
Well, I guess in this project, our focus has been on trying to get the framework right,
Yeah.
and leave some of the local details to local councils.
Yes.
And rather than standardising, we have been talking more about really a consistent approach that everyone follows a consistent framework, but has local
Very
differences.
nuanced, because we recognise that every council has nuances and different, especially in the, when we compare the local strategic planning statements, a lot of councils have very nuanced requirements.
Yeah, and I think within that there's also a bit of history to reflect on, because Sydney Water many decades ago had its stormwater levy, which led to the waterway levy that led to the construction of deep water ocean outfalls, a whole bunch of great work for the Hawkesbury Nepean system, dealing with what was the primary, relatively easy point source. And for many decades now, we've been struggling with diffuse pollution, which is primarily sourced from local government boundaries. And this is what we're trying to tackle. Yeah.
We've got one more question. The KCG uses enterococci as an indicator of waterway health. Do we recommend, do the recommended reforms equally reduce other pollutants to improve waterway health?
The key word there is an indicator.
Yeah.
It's enterococci is an indicator of waterway health. It's not the objective to reduce enterococci. And the objectives are broad, and enterococci is the indicator that you measure as an indicator of.
Especially because our vision is swimming in the Parramatta River, and so obviously microbial contamination is a big factor. But when that modelling that was done to develop the master plan, it looked at a range of factors, didn't it? So there's a lot of science, I guess, behind how we've come up with it.
And the vision is not just a swimming pool; it's a healthy living river.
Exactly. Yeah. Great. Well, we've got.
There's some online comments. Do you want me to read them out, or is Leanne going to do that?
I can't see them at the moment. So
Yep.
that would be lovely. Thank you.
Sorry, so Mike Healy says there are significant questions on sustainable and affordable funding for WSUD, in particular in public land and maintenance. Does the current funding model work for this? If not, what areas of improvement are being considered?
Yeah, so the simple answer, which is I think you know the answer, is the funding model doesn't work. And to me, it's a reflection of a values-based or a lack of a values-based funding. And so what we tend to do within our infrastructure funding, our maintenance funding, is look backwards. What did we fund last year? And apply that moving forward. Rarely do we take a sort of a refresh opportunity to say, what is genuinely important to people in the long term? And have that political courage to actually set that values-based budgeting process. What we tend to do in local government, and having worked in that sector for over 15 years, is you can shift the responsibilities back to the lot, because that's an easy policy lever to do. But we also know that the maintenance of lot-based stormwater controls is arguably even less sustainable, less effective than if it's managed by local government. And so there's an issue of shifting funding, but I think the parallel question is who is best served to maintain adequately with an outcomes focused the devices that policy changes put forward, whether it's at the lot or at a sub-regional, regional level.
There is a bit more discussion of all that in that paper.
Yeah. There is another question. Sorry.
Yeah.
We'll have one more. So
there's been comments around the fact that there's currently a bit of a disconnect between policy intent and legal mechanisms facilitating uniform application and mechanisms for council to access funds. So it's covering that funding framework, but I guess it is saying that at the moment it's kind of left entirely to councils, and you know, is that the gap that needs missing, that's missing here, that it's kind of handed over to councils and there's no other mechanism in place.
But, and I think there's no simple answer to that. I mean, it's definitely something we've brought up in the recommendations paper. And I think the value of the recommendations paper, we've got so many people involved in the PRCG, like we're in a really good position to influence this, I think, across Sydney. And we're working on that really. But yeah, I think we all have to work together to actually resolve this issue, because it's been an issue that's been around really since the stormwater levy came out in 2006, and there's a real recognition that the actual value of the levy has dropped significantly over the years because it hasn't increased. So look, it's really topical. No one has an answer. I think that's the point.
I think there's no single beautiful answer here, apart from more money. But essentially, somebody has to come up with money, and that's got to be framed that has political support, but also a capacity of individuals to contribute to that. So you've got an equity issue as well. So what was successful about Sydney Water's levy going back into the late 80s, early 90s, it applied across the whole of Sydney. And it led to some good infrastructure outcomes and to some extent some sustained maintenance outcomes. But now we're trying to tackle the diffuse question, which is lot-based, and how individuals take responsibility, but also how governments at state and local level can value clean waterways and sell the proposition of that in terms of rating changes.
Yeah. I think one of the things we should start talking about is not that we need more money for stormwater maintenance, but to shift the conversation towards money for multiple objective outcomes that help build a livable city. And stormwater is part of that, but it needs to be thought about in that bigger picture.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's right. So a good discussion on waterway objectives. Are there any objectives for urban amenity and what it's worth? That's a tricky one, isn't it?
Yeah, so part of what the Blue-Green Index, and we can talk more about this next time, and also the riparian corridors, when you're starting to talk about livability, you know, there's good evidence that if you have a well-vegetated landscape, people can connect to nature. They're generally happier than when they can't. And so that's one of the outcomes that we're after. So it's not about having an infiltration system in the front yard or a regional detention system. It's about all the other things that you can do in terms of multiple benefits to make these attractive places in cities, to make them, you know, you want to get outside and enjoy that, whether it's a nature experience, a park experience. So, you know, the goal of these indices or grids is about having more attractive but multi-purpose outcomes.
And there are some pretty strong objectives that have been set around, you know, access to green space and, you know, how many minutes you can walk to green space, how much access to in terms of area of green space. So I guess that is a kind of parameter for urban amenity. And a bit more of I think there's been a fair bit of research that's been done post or during COVID, depending on how you look at it, on people who are working from home and needing that local centres and you know, reinvigorating those local areas, because it's not necessarily people are going to ever go back to that full CBD commute every day. I'm going to wrap it up now because we're a few minutes over. So thank you for attending this webinar. I'm really proud of this piece of work, as I said, and I think it does have application across the state. And I just don't want to sit on a shelf, so I want to generate some discussion about it, and I want to really push the implementation of what we've identified. I'd like to thank Alexa and Peter and you for providing some good questions. The next webinar is this Thursday, so please book in, and we'll be talking in more detail about that framework for the Blue-Green Index tool, and that will really kind of touch on that urban amenity. So thank you very much for coming. See you later.